I've been working in the Maldives for 25 years on and off, essentially looking at the islands themselves, how old they are, how they formed and what changes them. And we're doing that for the reason of looking at how they're going to change over the next 20 to 30 years with sea level change. So all I wanted to do is really give an overview of the kinds of things we've been doing and then start to think about the practical realities of how you manage physically the island structure. So I called it Managing Reef Islands Living with Dynamic Shorelines because, as you are well aware, the shorelines of these islands are ever changing. So it's a little bit of basics. How we get these islands on these reef platforms requires several key things. One is actually you need the coral reef, and that's got to grow up to somewhere near sea level. So picture the farrow there. And if we zoom down on the reef surface, you've all had experience with looking at reasonably healthy bits of reef over time, corals and those kinds of things. Well, it's the breakdown of the coral and the shellfish and the crustacean and anything that produces calcium carbonate on that reef is providing the building blocks for all the islands that you have in the Maldives. Now that's quite interesting from a geological perspective because unfortunately to do that you do have to grind up and kill coral from time to time and you're waiting for the turnover of live organisms to die and their skeletons become part of what we call the sediment pool. So how do we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is the physical impact of waves on reefs that breaking corals and smashing them up into smaller pieces. And the other is schools of parrotfish that you see on and around this reef surface, and we've done some work in the next atoll south that suggests that in places in the Maldives, parrotfish are supplying maybe 80 to 90% of the sand that's being contributed to islands. And I say this for a good reason, and that is if you really want to maintain the health of an island, just like the marine resources, it's in the best interest to maintain the health of the reef itself. So there's another imperative why we should look after the reefs and the fish populations. It's because ultimately they're driving the production of sand, which ends up on our islands. And it's often a connection that many people don't make. Once we've sort of created this big reservoir of sand, we're then relying on the waves as they interact with the reef structure that drives currents, that picks up the sand on the reef flat and pushes it, transports it and deposits it in particular locations on reef surfaces. And that's essentially how we get islands where they are on reefs. And I'll show you some pictures a little later, but in the Maldives, what you find is that these shapes of islands often replicates the shapes of the reef structure themselves. And that is a direct result of the way that waves bend and break on the reefs and drive the currents across the reef surface to certain positions on the reef structure itself. So we get these nice little islands on the top, and that's banyan tree before the resort came along. Now, in terms of thinking about shoreline management and erosion, two things I want to say. One is, if you change any one of those boxes, you're going to change what the island looks like and where it is on the reef. If you turn off the supply of sand, if you change the way that waves either break and interact with the reef or break and interact with the shoreline, you're going to change where the sand is and you're going to move and change the island. Okay? Now there's, I guess, two sets of ways that we can make those changes. One are natural, so things like sea level change, which potentially is making the sea or water level deeper on the reef, is changing how much wave energy is getting across the reef and can attack the shorelines. Things like bleaching events that are coming through and periodically killing a lot of the coral is not good in the long term. In the short term, actually, that could be beneficial for islands because it generates a lot of dead carbonate for parrotfish to eat. And I don't know whether you observed following the 2016 bleaching event an explosion or an increase in the numbers of parrotfish around the reef platform. So they're all madly chewing the available dead coral substrate and actually generating pulses of sand. And as the reef grows back and the fish population's got to come into balance again, that sort of closes down. So these things are in flux continually. There's another way that we can change these processes, and that's the things we do. Things like digging up coral and sand off the reef, or digging up sand from the beaches, which was common throughout the archipelago, is all reducing the volume of sand that can contribute to the island and undermining its stability. Anything that we do that puts a structure on the reef or near the island shoreline, and we'll look at examples of this a little later, also changes the way that waves interact with the shoreline. It changes the way sediment is transported around that shoreline and can cause erosion in some places, but also land progradation in others. Okay, so pretty much anything that happens that changes those boxes, we have a subsequent change in the island shape. So some of the work that we've been doing over the past decade or so is to actually try and understand how islands do change over time. And I'm going to talk about two timescales. The first is over periods of 30, 40, 50 years or so, what are islands doing? And we've now compiled a data set of over 1,000 islands, which includes islands here in the Maldives, but also in other atoll systems in the Pacific, so Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands. And a remarkable thing is that pretty much every island we've looked at has changed quite substantially over the last half century. And what you see in this image here are three examples of how three of the most common ways that islands are changing. This is a black and white photo of an island in Tuvalu. This is Tupuka. This green dashed line is the outline of that island in 1897. So this is over a century of data in this plot. The blue line is what that island actually looked like in 2010. And you can probably start to appreciate that there's been some substantial removal of land and there's been a bit of progradation of land around that island. And that island's actually got smaller. You'll see in this example here, again, the green dashed line is 1897 and the blue line is 2010. That island is sort of migrating away from its reef towards the lagoon, presumably in response to higher wave energies coming across the reef. This example's interesting. These little green lines again represent a sequence of 6 individual islands on a reef rim over 100 years ago. And what's happened over the last century, as denoted by this blue line which envelops it all, is that those channels have filled up with sand being delivered from the reef, and those islands have welded together to become one individual island. And in that case, that island has increased substantially by something like 6 hectares in land area. So this linear extension and coalescence is another marked feature of how islands change. Now, we have done this in the Atoll South. We've looked at 256 islands in Garth Dal and Hooverdo, and without going into the detail, you can see that these examples, that islands are very changeable and dynamic. So the red lines in all of these shots represent 1969, and the colour images are around about 2010. So substantive movements and changes of these islands over time. And if we carry on and just look at a few more examples, and look at this one down here, this is an enormous amount of transition of this island from 1969 to what it looks like in 2010. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasise here is that these islands are very changeable. That's the kind of nature of what they are, and they're changing in response to variations in the marine conditions, the waves and currents, and also the amount of sediments that are available to them. Well, that brings us to your island, and this is an image that I snapshotted out of a report that was done a number of years ago. in which we have the island outline in 1969 and the outline in 2011 in red. Now, there's a couple of things to note there, I guess. One is substantial amount of change and movement around I guess it's the southeast end of the island, and also on this kind of northern and eastern sector of the island where it's been retreating. But there's been progradation along this southwest margin and on the northwestern tip. Now, of course, as you'd all appreciate, and Vinod is only so acutely aware, this is where you've got the major erosion issue with bungalows on the island surface at this particular location, and as it sort of wraps around the corner. In the context of this is what's been going on for 40 years, then it's not surprising you're having difficulties at that location on the island margin. A couple of things I would probably point out about that is that if this is an ongoing process, there's really nothing you can do to reverse this kind of long-term change. So, you know, what can you do about this? Because you've got erosion here. Well, over multiple decades, if the island is trying to rework its sediments, there's actually very little. What you're trying to do is have almost remedial emergency measures to try and retain the shoreline where it is. But the decadal trend for this island is that it's kind of trying to march towards the west. So that has implications, I think, for how you would go about thinking about management of the shoreline. So that's a sort of a decadal kind of snapshot, and the point I was trying to make there is that these islands are constantly in a state of change. I think there's a number of examples through this archipelago and others where there's been an expectation of development that the island should stay where it is, and that's created a lot of coastal management issues and legacies of problems that have emerged over time. Well, if we jump to the more here and now timescale of seasons to years and think about what we do, we've been involved in some work that's been monitoring shoreline changes across these 4 atolls in the northern part of the archipelago for a number of years. And the sorts of things we were doing was going to islands of all different shapes through these atolls, and across seasonal cycles mapping how the beach volume sort of varies and gets transported around these islands. And the reason we were trying to do that was to try and predict what's going on. Can we predict if the waves are coming from one side of a reef, where the sand's likely to go, and would that be helpful to support some sort of management decisions? Well, we've been doing that, or have done that for some sort of 15 years, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of the sorts of things that we've identified. So one of the things we do is that we get a mapping GPS and we walk around the very base of the beach, so we're in the water, and we define what we call the footprint of the beach. And in this example, this is the footprint of the beach at the end of the northeasterly monsoon. And this is an oblique shot of that island of Huladu in South Malos Madulu. And if we take a couple of photos along shore at those locations, nice wide 60 to 70 metre beach looking along this point, and almost no grain of sand on this shoreline at the end of the northeast monsoon. The monsoon, as you're well aware, switches, of course, and it's remarkable how quickly the sand volume responds to those changes in winds. This is 4 months later on this island, 4 months into the westerly monsoon, and if we look at shots from similar locations along this shoreline, we are bereft of sediment. It's been stripped away, and there's a lovely 60 to 70 metre beach deposited on the eastern shoreline. We supplement that with cross-shore profiles, so we get survey instruments and we go around the island doing cross-shore profiles, and we can define the amount of sand. That's essentially hard substrate there. That's the fillet of sand that gets picked up, transported away, and then it comes back in the following season. We had a bit of fun with this. What that's enabled us to do is start thinking, when we look at circular types of islands, they tend to behave the same. So sand tends to oscillate from one side of the island to the other. And here's another example of Kyoto that does the same. This is a slightly bizarre plot. What it was trying to represent is, at the end of all that change, where does the sand sit from one season to the next? And on this island, you get this kind of butterfly shape. So the sand tends to reside there, and then it'll change quickly, and then it'll reside on this side of the island. Now, of course, what that implies is that there's an enormous amount of sediment transport going around the island to achieve that amount of deposition. And it's something like 120,000 cubic metres of material being transported around the beach within 4 or 5 months, so high rates of sediment transport. Well, we then made, just for illustrative purposes, a little cartoon that tries to show that under the northeast monsoon, the sand all migrates to this side of the island, then the monsoon switches and the sand all migrates back to this side of the island. I'm going to come back to that very simple model in a few minutes' time, when we start to think about what we do about that in terms of management. If we look at elongate islands, and this is more akin to the kind of island that we're currently on, what we found on these elongate islands is that most of the sand variability and sand flux in islands that we've studied at least tends to be constrained to the tips or the ends of the island, and they seem to be by far the most dynamic parts of these sorts of islands, and that's denoted by these very large pulses that come out on these particular diagrams. If we put that in cartoon...
Irrespective of whether the tips and the bottoms are north or south or east or west. If it's a long island, it's the tip. In one side it might be north and one it might be east.
By and large, that's what we've found. Our sample set is small. We've only got a half dozen islands, and ideally you want 50 or 60, but in all different settings. But whenever we look at an elongate island, what we've found so far is the tips are always the most changeable. And so if we look at what that might look like in our little cartoon, as the seasons change, it pushes sand back along the shoreline on this particular island, then it swaps back again, and the spit starts to extend out in this direction. What you've probably got, which is not depicted in this cartoon, is that this end also is slightly more dynamic than this particular cartoon shows. So again, there is a flux of sand along these shorelines in the monsoons, but the greatest amount of changes that we observe seem to sit around these tip ends, or the island ends. Well, what we did with that, we did some work based on that monitoring for the Maldivian government a few years ago. And we tried to come up with some sort of sensible sort of management guidelines that could be adopted. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments. And it was based on the principles that you don't want to impact the natural processes around the island. And if we do that, that would lead to negative impacts. And unfortunately, what it means when you have these circular islands is that we shouldn't really be putting in structures around these circular islands, because you're going to start to impact the along-shore sediment transfers quite remarkably. What we indicated was where you have elongate islands, we should do everything we can to try and avoid inserting structures around the ends, and if we were going to put facilities in and things like that, the central body of the islands is probably the more stable components that we should be looking at when we need to take when we're planning and developing islands. And similarly, on these extremely long islands, the most stable elements seem to be the central trunk of the island, and the dynamic tips seem to be areas that we recommended. If you're in a position where you could have a choice, you should try and leave those alone and leave them to their natural devices. Now, that doesn't help where you've already got things stuck in the shoreline and thinking about what you can do about it. And in many ways, the way that that communities have transformed the way they've lived on islands in the last decades isn't very compatible with how the islands want to behave and how they want to work. And as a consequence, we've used a lot of interventions on island shorelines, and arguably some of them have worked, and arguably many of them haven't. And these are largely transposed from other developed countries, US, Europe, and those kinds of places, and used on reef surfaces. And so what I thought I'd do is just then look at a few examples of these and what they actually do to island shorelines, using some examples that you do have around Six Senses. So groins are a very commonly used tool from coastal engineering. These are these shore perpendicular structures of which you have a number. And I guess it's worth thinking about, if you put a structure in the shoreline, how does it interfere with the natural processes of the island? So if you stick something that's poking out from the shoreline, your intent, hopefully, is that you're trying to trap sand on one side of that groin, and that hopefully is then based on some understanding that alongshore sediment transport is the primary way that sand circulates around the island, okay, which in these circular islands is certainly the case, and it certainly seems to be the case here. Now, if you take our model island and we stick a groin in that location, all of a sudden we've changed fundamentally the nature of sediment flux around that island. Yes, you're going to build up sand on this part of the island, but essentially you've deprived sediment leaking to this part of the island. And why that's important is that when the seasons change, you're already in deficit on this part of the island, and the wave processes are going to keep, I'll put it up again. So you put your groin in, ideally all that sand wants to march over here, but it can't because it's blocked. So you have a deficit of sand on this island, so that when the monsoon switches, it transports that sand away very quickly, and all of a sudden it can then start chewing into the vegetated shoreline and tends to exacerbate erosion. What we find often, and there was an example on a previous image, is when that happens, there's then a proliferation of groins that tend to pop up all around the island, and the outcome of that process, if we go up here, I think there's one there, all these groins, you then tend to segment all your sand resources into little sectors around your island. And arguably, that's kind of happened here. You have this wonderful wide beach, where it is, just over there, which is kind of pinned or pegged. And it's lovely. It's quite unusual on a reef island, but as a consequence, much of that sand is kind of locked up in that big wide beach, and it can't get back and around to support the natural dynamics of the island shoreline. So that's kind of what groins do, and that's not to say you can't use groins. It's to say if you use a groin, that is the outcome that's going to happen unless you design them sensitively. And there's different ways you can design groins, and this one's actually an interesting example because you'll see it's stepped. And there's the subtle design criteria here are if sand was moving along and getting stuck at this level and more sand comes along, it'll transfer to the next piece. So you can fill up the beach to the level you want, and then sand can continue to leak around the shoreline. But you need to have your fillet of sediment that's able to undertake those kinds of changes. So groins are one mechanism. Seawalls, of course, are another, and you've got at least one example of a seawall where you've got perhaps your most critical erosion issue, and that seawall exhibits most of the impacts of seawalls that gets spoken of around the world. And that is, it's being undermined, you're losing blocks out of it, it's being flanked and you're losing sediment behind it. And currently then you're nourishing the beach to try and keep sand against that wall and to feed that shoreline. Well, let's just kind of have a look at what typically happens to shorelines when you put seawalls in. The sand in this case will go past the seawall until it's moved off, and then waves start to excavate out the sides of these seawalls and leave these rather nasty kind of scars on either side of the seawall. It's quite difficult also, you probably notice when you walk to that end of your island, and even when you look at the extra wall that's been built on the piece of beach rock that runs oblique underneath jetty B, that waves come in, smack against the wall and they'll reflect back off. Actually, that reflection process can also transfer sediment in the wrong direction for you. So seawalls, again, they can work if they're engineered properly, but they work to protect what's behind the seawall. They're never going to protect the beach itself. So if you put a seawall in, and there's reasons why you put seawalls in, you must always expect that you intend to lose the beach in front of that seawall. Okay? Unless you're going to put a fleet of groins in at that location. So each of these things is fundamentally changing the way the island shoreline works. Here's another example of a different mechanism, and these are these offshore breakwaters, and you'd be very familiar with these. And we go back to my crude little model again. If we put a breakwater in on the top, all of a sudden it changes the way that waves interact with that breakwater, and it drives sediment from either side up in towards the structure itself, and it's kind of undermined the natural dynamics of the beach, and you start to get erosion cuts in different parts of your island. Now, this is never the intention, of course, when you put one of these breakwaters in, and so it's very important that if you're thinking about different ways to try and manage at one location, to think about, well, hang on, what's that going to do elsewhere around the island shoreline? If we think about what the breakwater does, it essentially is trying to break the wave energy before it hits the beach. And it's arguable whether that actually works. And if you think about the nature of the sediment transport on your island, it's more alongshore than across shore and onshore. So it's having an impact and interfering with the natural alongshore processes that take place along the shoreline. So that's breakwaters. And I'm just going to go to one last example to look at harbours. Now, you don't have a harbour in your island, but many of your neighbouring communities do have harbours. And harbours are like very large double-sided groins. And on an elongate island, this is a direct blockage to sand flowing both ways. So you basically cut your sediment transport system in half, and that tends to lead to erosion problems, all over the place on these islands. And I've yet to really see an island in the Maldives that's put a boat harbour in that hasn't led to these sorts of issues. And then they start talking about we've got to manage the erosion problem because we've got a boat harbour. And the fact is the boat harbours are probably far too large for most of the small islands anyway. And there was little thought put into where around the island shoreline could we put a boat harbour that minimises these sorts of effects.